The respiratory system are the organs that work together to help you breathe. So it obtains oxygen from the atmosphere and removes carbon dioxide from your body's cells. The functions of the respiratory system, other than just simply breathing, well, there's tubes in the respiratory system, like the trachea and the bronchi, and those filter, warm, and moisturize incoming air. And then there's also these microscopic sacs or alveoli that you find at the distal ends of the bronchial tree, and those are for exchanging gases. And this idea of filtering and warming air is oftentimes overlooked, but like when you breathe in on a really cold day, the reason why your lungs don't get damaged is because as the air comes in, first of all, you're only exchanging a portion of what's in your lungs, but secondarily, it's flowing through these tubes, and that slowly warms it up, so you don't have this sub-zero air coming in direct contact with your lungs. You'll remember from before that the nose and the trachea, all the respiratory tract, or most of the respiratory tract, is lined with this pseudostratified, ciliated columnar epithelium. Remember what that does is it traps dirt and dust particles, and then the cilia beat and they sweep that away. So like these particles of dust here, they get caught in the mucus and the cilia beat it until it gets up into the mouth area, and then you can either spit it out or oftentimes swallow it. So embedded within the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, we have these goblet cells. These goblet cells are the mucus secreting cells. We can see these goblet cells here. We never talked about goblet cells specifically, but now is a good time to learn what they are. So here's a goblet cell. Those secrete mucus. There's two principal divisions of the respiratory system. We have the upper respiratory tract, which includes the nose, the nasal cavity, the sinuses, and then part of the pharynx, which is behind the nasal cavity and behind the oral cavity. So the pharynx is located back here. And then we have the lower respiratory tract, which is the larynx, the trachea, and then the bronchial tree, which you see here, and then also the lungs. So let's stop and let's take a look at the larynx. What the larynx does is it protects and houses the vocal cords, and then the larynx acts as sort of like the gatekeeper and decides what goes in and out of your trachea, or what can enter and what can leave your lungs. So this is looking at the trachea through an endoscope, and this is a little cartoon illustration of the same thing. So here we have what are called the true vocal cords. They're called the true vocal cords because these are the ones that produce sound. And then right adjacent to that, we have the false vocal cords. These also sort of cover up the opening to the trachea, but they don't produce any sound. That's why they're called the false vocal cords. And this shape that you see up here, this is the epiglottis. That's the flap that closes or shuts over your trachea when you swallow to ensure that food doesn't enter your windpipe. So when you swallow, you'll notice that your larynx goes up. And as your larynx goes up, it sort of pushes the tongue and epiglottis together, and your tongue pushes down on that epiglottis. So in addition to the epiglottis folding shut, these false vocal cords also come together to seal off this entrance so food and water doesn't get down there. So if we were to look at the endoscopic picture, we see the trachea here. So this is headed towards the lungs. You can even see the rings. Remember, that's hyaline cartilage. Not that you're seeing here, but on the outside of it, there's the cartilage. And then here's the true vocal cords. These are the false vocal cords on either side. And then this is the epiglottis that would snap shut and cover the opening. All right, so let's look at the upper respiratory tract a little more carefully. Here's the nose. And then here's the nasal cavity, and in there you would find the pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And then we also have the sinuses. The sinuses are included as part of the respiratory system. They help function to lower the weight or to reduce the weight of the skull, and also these are important in sound quality production and other things. Behind the nasal cavity and behind the oral cavity, we have this area called the pharynx. And then right distal to that, that's where we have the larynx. And here's the epiglottis. You can see it folds sort of anteriorly to posteriorly, and it covers up this area, covers up the vocal cords and the trachea. So the lower respiratory tract starts at the larynx, and then includes the trachea. Notice again these cartilaginous rings made of hyaline cartilage. And then as we go distal down the respiratory tract, we see that the trachea bifurcates. It splits and it goes to the left and to the right. These are called primary bronchi. Primary because you have one going to each lung. And then that divides again into secondary bronchi, and then again into tertiary bronchi, and then into bronchioles, and then, well, here's some more images, into bronchioles, and then eventually we have these terminal bronchioles and respiratory bronchioles, and then that leads to these alveolar sacs, which are composed of alveoli. So I went through that fast, primarily because we're not going to concern ourselves with learning all those names, but let's just go through it sort of without the names, if you will. So this is the trachea. It splits, and as it splits, these bronchi get increasingly smaller until eventually they're called bronchioles. And then they get increasingly smaller still, and they become like these terminal bronchioles or respiratory bronchioles. And then at the end of those, we have these alveolar sacs. We do want to know that name. We do want to know what the alveolar sacs are and what the alveoli are. One alveoli is referred to as an alveolus. So here would be an alveolus. And notice that it's covered in a capillary bed. So this would be deoxygenated blood coming from the heart. And then as the deoxygenated blood moves across the alveoli, remember, which is filled with air, the red blood cells take or grab hold of the oxygen from the alveoli, so then the blood becomes oxygenated, and that oxygenated blood then returns back to the heart. And in the same way, this blood that's coming from the heart is filled with carbon dioxide, or has high concentrations of carbon dioxide, I should say, and then that diffuses out when you get to the alveoli. And then when this returns back to the lungs, or back to the heart rather, it has a lower concentration of carbon dioxide. So here's where the gas exchange actually takes place. It takes place at the level of the alveoli. Notice also some smooth muscle. We've studied smooth muscle. And individuals that take an inhaler, those are called bronchodilators. So if they have spasms here, when you introduce that medication, what that medication does is it dilates or relaxes these smooth muscle cells, and then these bronchioles are able to open up or dilate and allow for better airflow. So this is a histological slide of the alveoli. Your book here refers to this as an alveolus. I would think this is more likely an alveolar sac. And then these other small ones here would be considered alveoli. It's also consistent what I found on Yale's website. They refer to this area as like the alveolar sac, and then each one of these little spaces would be alveoli. But remember that this is all simple squamous epithelium. All right, now let's look at the lungs. The lungs sit in the pleural cavity. Remember the pleural cavity? And they're separated medially by the mediastinum. The mediastinum, remember, includes these vessels and the heart. So on the medial side of the lungs, we have the mediastinum. And then inferiorly, we have the diaphragm. And then to the sides, or laterally, we have the thoracic wall. Let's continue to look at the lungs. But let's look at the lobes of the lung. The right lung has 3 lobes: the superior lobe, the middle lobe, and the inferior lobe. The right lung is a little bit larger than the left lung. You'll recall that the heart takes up some of the space where like the left lung could be, if you will. So because of the presence of the heart, the left lung is smaller. The left lung's got 2 lobes. It has a superior lobe and the inferior lobe. Let's look at the covering of the lungs now. If you recall, the heart had that pericardial cavity or the pericardial sac, and then we had the visceral pericardium and the parietal pericardium. The lungs are sort of arranged in a similar way. So we have the visceral pleura. The visceral pleura is a membrane that covers the lungs. So the green line that you see that's in contact with the lungs, that's the visceral pleura. We see that labeled over here, visceral pleura. Now we have the parietal pleura. The parietal pleura is not in direct contact with the lung. Rather, it's in contact with the thoracic cage or the inside of the chest wall. So we see that label here. This is the parietal pleura. And then the pleural cavity, that refers to the potential space that exists between the visceral pleura and the parietal pleura. There's not really much of a space there because these two membranes are touching each other, or essentially functionally touching each other, if you will. And what's in between them is really only a layer of fluid. So you always hear about when breathing is described, they say, well, you increase the size of your chest, your lungs get bigger, and then air comes rushing in. I always wondered, well, when I increase the size of my chest, the lungs are inside my chest, so why do my lungs get bigger as well? You can think about the lungs expanding with the chest cage. So take a look at this video here. Think about one of the slides being the visceral pleura that covers the surface of the lungs, and the other side being the parietal pleura, which covers the wall of the thoracic cavity. Notice how the two slides stick together because of the water that's on them. In the same way, the visceral and parietal pleura of the lungs stick together. So when you breathe and your chest expands, your lungs expand with it. They stick to it, just like these microscope slides stick to each other. Here's another image. So here's the lung. Here's the chest wall. If you could zoom in on that, again, this is the lung. This is the chest wall. And then covering the lung, we have the visceral pleura. And then in contact with the chest wall, we have the parietal pleura. And then in between, we have the pleural cavity. And that pleural cavity is what's filled with that watery fluid, and that lubricates the surface between the two pleural membranes. So these would be our two microscope slides that are in contact with each other.